I think to me that the most obvious part that was likable about Acolyte was, okay, well, we're building. You know what I mean? Like there's a storyline here that abandoning doesn't seem like it makes sense because it introduced so many different concepts that opened our minds to things that were, I'm sorry, tons more fun.
You're listening to Around the Galaxy.
To the Star Wars Fan Talk Show. I am one of your hosts, Pete Fletzer, and along with my co-host Nick Milkey, we bring you the conversations with the people behind the Star Wars fandom. It is great to have you with us. This is actually our first episode since March of this year. It's the longest break we've ever taken. We've been busy working on and enhancing our live Thursday night show, which you can catch on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@the SSW Network every week at 9 p.m. Eastern. That's every Thursday night at 9. And every Thursday on ATG Live, we bring you the latest Star Wars news. We deep dive into fascinating topics from the galaxy far, far away, and we chat with some amazing guests. And then we bring those guest interviews over here to the feed, along with some special episodes recorded specifically for the podcast. Well, this week, we are thrilled to have a special guest joining us, Clinton Yates of ESPN and the official ESPN podcast for Star Wars, Never Tell Me the Odds. He is here to talk about something that's been on a lot of fans' minds. We'll be discussing the end of The Acolyte, which unfortunately hasn't been renewed for a second season on Disney+. Clinton, who's a big fan of the show, will share his thoughts on why this series was so significant and what might be next for it. So buckle up, because we've got an exciting conversation ahead. But before we dive into that interview, a quick reminder to connect with us on social media to stay updated on all things around the galaxy. You can find us at our website at the SSWnetwork.com. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, also at the SSW Network, or you can follow this show specifically on Twitter or X or whatever they want to call it these days at ATGcast. And don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the SSW Being a patron gives you early access to shows, invites you to special events, and even a chance to join us live with celebrities during some of our special recording sessions. Also, if you have any questions, comments, you want to leave us a voicemail, you can do that now too. You can call us at 504-321-1501. That's 504-321-1501. That's our comment line. Give us a call. We would love to hear from you. All right, let's jump right into our conversation with Clinton Yates. We'll get his take on The Acolyte, what went wrong, and why this show was a crucial piece of the Star Wars puzzle.
We are joined by one of our favorite people. He has become a great friend of the show. Clinton Yates is here. Clinton, what is up, my friend?
Doing well. I'm glad I get to show off my new background to you guys. We could go through this forever, but we don't necessarily have all.
We're going to do another night where we do show and tell.
That's
night.
a separate discussion. But,
that's right.
Just quickly, we have arranged some things, and throughout the course of the conversation, if you want to throw out random questions about where these things were acquired from, feel free.
Just periodically name an item and just see how long it takes to get the story on it. It's like Where's Waldo, but nerdier. Well, we are excited to have you back. We love any chance we get to have a conversation with you. And our conversation tonight really revolves around The Acolyte. Pete and I have talked just briefly about The Acolyte since the show ended a couple weeks ago. Obviously, the news in the last week of it not being renewed for a second season, but we have not really dug into just kind of a postmortem after this season, what we thought, what we felt about it. And you and I went back and forth, in some messages, right? Kind of when the news came out that it wasn't going to be renewed, you sent me a message and we talked for a little while. And I really loved your thoughts. So that's what we're going to jump into tonight. And we've got you here. I know, Pete, you have feelings about the show, not only what we got, how you enjoyed it. I do as well. But Clinton, let's start with you and let's just jump into, high level. We got this new show, The Acolyte. It was set in the High Republic era. It brought us a lot of things that we had never seen before. And I know that you really enjoyed it. And the other thing that I think our viewers and our listeners would want to key into, if you haven't heard us when we've talked to Clinton before, but you're a story and a narrative guy. And there's so much of that in this show. So I'm going to let you kind of lead us off with some of your high level thoughts.
Well, I'll start to begin with the notion of who I am. For those of you who don't know, if you have not listened to this show before and have not heard me on here, my name is Clinton Yates. I write for ESPN. I host a show called Never Tell Me the Odds with Ryan McGee and Art Ocal. Shouts to Kelsey Puckett, who produces the program, as well as Aaron Thornton, who runs the whole show. But I was at the Acolyte premiere, in person. And the only reason I say this is because it informs, some level of what I believe initial interest was, not just from people that were regular fans, but the humans that participated in the program itself. It was kind of a deal, for lack of a better term. And, people like Amandla, Manny, and so on, people who have become sort of stars in a mini way, they were all there. It was all very much a full-blown operation within what I'll just call the Star Wars industrial universe, cinematically. And look, when I first heard the news, I was bummed for a couple reasons. Number one, I just felt that everybody kind of thought, based on what was on the screen, that it's going to be really difficult to abandon such a good storyline because so many different branches of a tree, tentacles from a squid or octopus, or tectonic plates, even, if you will, to insert whatever metaphor you want here, had been grown, squirmed, or shifted in a way that made this very interesting. And my first thought about the program was, what a great idea to go complete blank slate protocol, as Ryan McGee would say. What a fantastic place to start with something in order to get a new idea off the ground, not just in terms of who's doing what person to person, but like what kind of story you're telling. And I'll wrap up this opening point with what I felt from the beginning was obvious, but I think that was difficult for a lot of a certain type of a fan to accept, was that this was YA, for lack of a better term, young adult sort of literature adapted to what is effectively the television screen. And that was clear to me from the beginning. And thus what I understood from the buy-in made it that much better in terms of the level of emotion I was expecting to deal with, the level of unfamiliarity with life and the world that was presented, and also the level of deception in people you trust when you're operating at that age in the world and you don't really know who's supposed to be a person that you can keep your faith in and who's not. And so I felt that when that was abandoned, it really snuffed out what was, to me, one of the better plants that was planted in this universe in a long time. For me, that wasn't just a look back thing with a fair amount of Easter eggs and shiny things around it. It really was something new and original. And Nick, that to me was where I first was like, oh man, that was a tough one, because I like this a lot, because I think it's more things than a lot of things did.
You talked about, new things. And for some of us, and I don't know where you are, Pete and I haven't read any of the High Republic books. Like, I'm only familiar with it through being a Star Wars fan, seeing other people talk about it, seeing creators like Charles Soule and some of these people do interviews. And so I have the lowest level, like, conversation. Like, I knew Vernestra Rowe was a High Republic character. I knew, I knew what Starlight Beacon was. Like, I knew just essentially, if I had looked it up on Wikipedia, that's about how much I know, or Wikipedia even. So that's what I knew. So I was not familiar with this era, this time frame. So it was for me, and I think this is part of what I'm picking up for you, is it was very new. These are different Jedi. We knew it was going to be a Jedi story, but we're getting Jedi at a different time, which I think is one of the pluses in this category of some of the things that we saw that grabbed right away. The thing that I messaged to you, and that was one of my favorite things from this series the whole time, was the approach of how the Force was talked about and how it was as Luke Skywalker said in The Last Jedi, the Jedi don't own the Force. There's this group of witches, and it's called the Thread. And we have, in Rebels, you have the Ashla and the Boga. You have, there's different, the Force or God or whatever your higher power is can be called a bunch of different things in a bunch of different places, because guess what? It's a big ass galaxy.
Yeah.
And the fact that we haven't gotten that, Star Wars has always been very corporatized Jedi, the Force, those things all go together for the most part. And so to me, that opened up again, new doors and new storytelling avenues to go, what is the Force like in, space Australia or space, Japan
right.
or wherever,
or space Denmark or whatever it may be. And I think Pete, quickly, I that was the thing that really realized it to me, in the sense of very much of what the Star Wars galaxy is fantasy on a level that you've kind of got to depart in order to really get there. You're not really going to relate to a Cassian Andor running through the galaxy, being trapped, in a prison in which they're side building the Death Star and they don't know. Is that gripping? Of course. Is that kind of singular? Yes. But the Acolyte immediately introduced you to 6 characters that reminded you probably of somebody you might have gone to high school or college with or come across in the workforce. There was a very kind of normal interaction to it that led to the dialogue as well being quite fresh and moving in a way that made it feel kind of like a very normal American sitcom, if I may, or maybe not even sitcom, but just kind of a regular show. Pete, does that make sense? The
totally.
The dialogue was so basic that I really actually enjoyed that for the kind of age level and the topical presentation we were getting.
I think that's part of the challenge that Star Wars is facing right now, though, and I think the Acolyte, unfortunately, became the poster child for the what the quote unquote average Star Wars fan is. And I don't think that the credit that's being given to the toxic fans online for bringing down the show is as impactful as is believed to be. I think the problem is more, it didn't appeal to the wider audience. I honestly don't think Disney cares if it appeals to, a guy who's got 3 million followers when you got 154 million subscribers on Disney Plus. That's a small percentage, and most of them are watching it anyway, by the way. Let's be honest. So I don't disagree with you as far as the way the story sold. And one of the things that just last week when we had Greg Iwinski on, Greg Iwinski said he is not holding Star Wars to Empire Strikes Back level every time he sees something. He's holding it to the level of those novels that we read in the 90s and early 2000s that kept Star Wars alive. And keeping, and I know you or at least Arda comes into Star Wars through Disney, which is a very interesting way to come to Star Wars. But people need to realize that not every piece of Star Wars is going to be Rogue One caliber or Empire Strikes Back. It's going to tell an interesting story. It's just a matter of finding an audience for it. And I think that's the problem right now, is finding that audience for it.
I think, to me, that the most obvious part that was likable about Acolyte was, okay, well, we're building. You know what I mean? There's a storyline here that abandoning doesn't seem like it makes sense, because it introduced so many different concepts that opened our minds to things that were, I'm sorry, tons more fun than a lot of these other live action series, if I'm being quite earnest. And listen, I'm not one to knock what the great storytellers of the world choose to do with their storylines, but I do think there was something here that was a cut above, at least for me, some of the other things. What Leslie chose to do with the lore was really something that I don't think, to your point, Pete, the average Star Wars fan was ready for.
Correct.
This is like when, I don't know, just to use a school out of nowhere, I don't know, let's just say if Ohio State, a team that typically runs the ball down your throat, is suddenly going to a run and shoot, things that have happened in the real world, people are like, whoa, you know what I mean? What does that look like? And I think there was a lot of that was suffered from. But to get back to my original point about what the average Star Wars fan wants, this to me seemed like a clear and well-executed attempt at bringing on different fans.
Yeah.
If you Google Acolyte cast, there's a 8-person pop-up that comes up, and sorry, kiddos, there are 0 white men in that lineup, in that first lineup. And you can call it woke or whatever. By the way, when that word entered the lexicon, I knew it was finito. But what I'm saying is that if you're willing to believe and suspend your disbelief for something like Star Wars, like, obviously there's a galaxy that has a lot of different people in it that aren't just people wearing masks or costumes. They can look like themselves and be part of the whole thing. And that seemed to be such an obvious, refreshing jump that, you know, kind of when abandoned, or when, frankly, when initially critiqued by a lot of people, I was like, yo, come on. Like, there's an obvious problem you have with this, and it is not remotely related to what this show looks like or what the storyline is like. It was colorful. It was fast paced. Heck, we can get into this later, but I'm sorry. The fight choreography was insane. You know, like, point to point, there was no real reason to say this doesn't work outside of all the people who just was never going to think it was going to work. Which is,
well, I mean, the very fact that it was downvoted on Rotten Tomatoes before it even came out tells you that people were not judging the show. They were there,
or not to mention it was review bombed, except they review bombed the wrong thing. Something else also called The Acolyte.
Right.
Yes, and like, look, that's a whole other discussion. That, you know, I'll say it this way. And I've said it before on this program, I really feel for Star Wars fans that don't like Star Wars, because it seems like there's so much happening in that realm where people are doing that weird thing where they try to define what something is supposed to be, and they don't have, never mind the critical thinking background, but quite frankly, the artistic and media literacy to understand what the movies and series are about to begin with. The whole point of what Lucas was doing was mimicking, copying, and paying homage to things that he thought were excellent filmmaking and storytelling devices. That goes from costuming, that goes from storylines to storyboards. And also, like, you know, the whole kind of point of it was that at the time when it came out, no, it wasn't super brilliant. No, that wasn't the best thespianism in the world, nor necessarily the best screenplays, but people liked it. And I get that. And so when now a certain percentage of people act as if, because whatever their sensibilities aren't met, that it means that it's not good, I'm like, what? When did all of a sudden everybody who was even a remote Star Wars fan become the most existential critic of all movies at all times? It doesn't make sense to me. And so that was the most unfortunate part to me, is that it felt like the smart people doing well with this didn't get the chance.
How would you feel about this show being continued as an animated series? Because this was an $180 million risk that, unfortunately, I mean, the numbers, again, take all the other surrounding bullshit out, the numbers didn't play. They could do a 15 episode series for about $15 million, $10 million in animation and continue this story. Do you think it's, or is that giving up on the people who are building the live action version of this world?
I think there's some of both, and I'm not supposed to do this, but I can comment on your suggestion, which is that I do think that the live action version did a lot more for a lot of people who are not necessarily going to be the humans that are yelling on message boards or quite frankly on podcasts on YouTube. And I don't mean that in an insincere way, as we all do this. I look at it somewhat like, let's just say the baseball world. You guys know that I'm a sports writer. And like there's a certain hardcore fans in certain cities of America where baseball looks like what it's supposed to look like, or quite frankly, football or even hockey, you know, for you, Pete, looks like what it's supposed to look like. But at a certain point, you're like, well, okay, that's always going to be there. What about all these other people who actually like the sport for different reasons? You're not going to start deleting people off of rosters who are actually good just because they play for, I don't know, the Marlins or whatever. You know what I mean? And like, that's kind of how I feel about that. And I just feel that the Star Wars universe at this point offers so much. And for the live action shows to be put on this sort of bizarre pedestal. I mean, how many numbers are some of these other thing. I mean, I look, I don't know the numbers for Bad Batch or Tales of the Jedi, and I don't ever hear about them. You know what I mean? Because they don't involve the same type of characters. And I'm not here to play comparison, but my point is that to me, all of this is fit into the same galaxy universe for a reason. And, we can dive into this a little bit more in a second, but particularly the storyline here was so much better executed to me than a lot of things that have happened that I felt like, oh man, this is, you're sitting the wrong quarterback on some level. You know what I'm saying? If this guy can't play, kind of thing. If that's or girl in this case, in terms of the creator of the show.
Yep, for sure. Yeah.
Well, and I want to tag back on something else that you talked about a minute ago, talking about George Lucas, what he did, in the 70s creating Star Wars. You talked about this doesn't look like what everybody expected it to look like. If George Lucas made Star Wars to look like everything else that was going on in the 70s, we were getting another John Wayne movie. We were getting, American Graffiti Part 2, like
with spaceships,
all these great things. But with spaceships, like he didn't do that. He took a unique, singular vision, and it was not the most well-known actors. I mean, you had Alec Guinness, you had, a couple of people, but like these are all unknowns. This is a story. This is cobbled together with, ping pong tables in a parking lot in the valley, making this thing. But I think the thing that's in there, and I think the thing that I'm seeing more as I've reflected on Acolyte and even listening to you talk, is the heart in all of it. The heart that was in the original Star Wars and the passion that went into the person and people who made that. That was what made 1 million people standing outside the Chinese theater going around the block in 1977 and 1978. Drove that, passion and excitement and holy crap, this feels new and different. I honestly think part of the outcry from a lot of people that are disappointed and even people who gravitated to the show, because like you said, Pete, there are numbers. It started out pretty big and those numbers continue to go down through the season, which makes it hard for a big business to justify the cost of that show. But there was a lot of heart in this show. And when you see characters like Soul, I mean, I was Jeckie from the beginning. There was, the people who, loved, Manny and the Stranger. And even from the other side, like I was anti-Yord from the first time he came on the screen. But that was a heartfelt decision that I made because he was kind of like some of the douches that I went to school with. And so
relatable character.
Correct.
Am I wrong?
Like you said, a relatable character. So I think that, and I just would love your feedback on, how you feel if this connects. But like there was a heart in this show that was different than the father-son Mando and Grogu story, that was different than the heart familiar, oh, I like Boba Fett because he was a cool character with a mask from 1980. This feels like it has a more direct connection to some of those earlier pioneering days that also makes it hard to go, we don't get more of that kind of heart and story.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also why a certain part of the fan base didn't like it. They didn't see themselves being centered, and they didn't necessarily latch on to what it was. And I respect that. The issue for me is not with that being the concern. It's with whether or not, man, is this really kind of who we want to be as a fan base? And we're not going to go take a huge left turn onto that avenue. But like for this to sort of play out so obviously as if it catered to that group was unfortunate, because I do think that for the first time, at least in my experience with really taking a hardcore look at each of these shows, for the purposes of sort of scholarship, for lack of a better term, I was like, wow, this is really good. Like, like no questions asked. And sort of, if you didn't need to understand Star Wars, I'm using air quotes for those who might be listening just on the pod, you didn't really need to understand it to sort of get an idea of what was going on within this particular universe. And, on top of that, quickly, Nick, to get back to what you were saying about the original sort of look and feel, is that, the visual vocabulary of this particular program to me was elegant and stunning in a way that I think is always going to be what the lasting image is. I watched this again, the series, and I watched the first 4 episodes again just to kind of reacclimate myself and think about it. And you know what I did for the next 4 episodes? I put it on mute. I just looked at it. And I was like, wow, the colors, the composition, the way they operated with twins as characters between children and adults, and introducing new, for lack of a better term, spiritual concepts visually. I was like, wow, this is really thoughtfully well done. And it looks good. If you'd asked somebody to say, hey, I'd like a Star Wars project out of you. This is getting an A+. If you're just otherwise looking at it and not sort of holding it to whatever. And, that's, look, I'm probably getting a little too loose out of school here, but that was where I was really kind of confused about what a lot of people who I considered to be somewhat self-respecting Star Wars fans looked at it as. They had all these flippant remarks like, I didn't think the casting was right, or if you're going to make a kung fu movie, make it a kung fu movie, or whatever. And I'm like, what? You know what I mean? Like, what are we talking about here? The whole point of what, to me, Star Wars was, at least cinematically, specifically, was bringing together a lot of different cultures in a kind of camp way that made you laugh, but also had things that you weren't going to see in other places. And I don't know that the Acolyte wasn't the best example I've seen of that in a long time in the Star Wars galaxy, whether or not you want to rate it like order wise against other shows or not.
As the sort of Star Wars scholars, to a degree, to use the term you just used, the three of us here on the screen are big Star Wars nerds. And so the lore building of this show was, I think, what sucked us in, right? What also worked really well was this sort of introduction to a different time in Star Wars. I think I always think about people like my sister-in-law, who, when we went to see The Rise of Skywalker, The Mandalorian season 1 was coming to an end. She never watched either one. We walked out of The Rise of Skywalker and she said, I thought there was supposed to be a Baby Yoda in this. So you look at that bell curve of the average fan. This might have that might have been what lost them, and it's unfortunate. And again, I keep going back to the risk that they took, which I'm really glad they did, because it was a really great story. And people who are saying, oh, it's going to be deleted from the canon and all these other, that's never going to happen.
No, that's not possible.
But it is unfortunate that we're not going to get that continuation. And I agree with you. I think Leslie Headland, I've said it before, I think Leslie Headland is probably the biggest Star Wars fan to make a Star Wars project since Dave Filoni. I mean, the stuff she put in there was so deep and such a deep dive. Yeah.
It was beyond a deep dive. I mean, it was the kind of thing that made you really think like, oh, we're going places, the whole idea of Immaculate Conception, not just being for a Skywalker, or not just being for one particular individual in the entirety of the galaxy, the entire concept of, what was happening with the witches, the whole notion that the Jedi Order was not considered the part and parcel highest of the mighty judgment wise, and not because they were being chased around the globe, but because people just were like not banging with them. And we're like, nah, you guys are kind of weird. Like, and there was an element that showed something that made a lot of things down the line make a lot more sense. And I don't just mean in sort of specific ties with, old Palpatine talking to Anakin or whatever, but I mean, just in general, the idea that there were things that could go wrong. And, we talked about this a little bit on our show, Never Tell Me the Odds, where it was like, Jedis be lying to people.
Yes, the shadiness of
genuine dishonesty. There's no two ways about this. And I remember during the course of the season, we did probably 3 episodes about the program. I was getting pissed. I was like, what? I don't like how this is going. And I don't mean this in terms of me judging the scenario, but the storyline was genuinely upsetting me because I was that involved. And that's the kind of thing that I really enjoy when I'm watching a show. I don't care if it makes me mad, as long as it kind of makes some level of sense. And this did to me, and it was compelling in that way, in a way that I haven't felt in a long time. And, look, I don't know how you guys feel about, spoilers or whatever, but I said this on our program as well. That Saul, I had clocked as a bad guy from the jump. And I don't mean that just in terms of the binary, but I was like, I don't like how this guy's moving. I do not trust him, blah. And it was upsetting me. You know what I mean? So by the time it finally came around, I was like, man, that was satisfying. And what a roller coaster to take somebody like me on, who doesn't normally do that. You know what I mean? I'm not normally super attached to people 2-3 episodes in necessarily. And so that kind of flipped my own script in a way that I was like, all right, I can't act like this isn't affecting me in a good way or rather in an impactful way, because it mattered to me a lot.
So let me tie that to, I think we might have even talked about it when you were on the show last time as well. Back in 1977, things were different. You trusted the good guys. The bad guys were obviously the bad guys, and there was no middle ground. Even though you're talking about rebels who literally blow up a Death Star with millions of innocent people on it, it's a terrorist act, right? Is it? Well, but
this is the whole thing.
That's where I'm going with it. Because in 1977, the world just didn't even think about that, right? It was, good guys, bad guys. And the people who can't get on board for Star Wars post the Disney acquisition are also people who maybe Star Wars for them is, he's a bad guy, she's a good guy, things are simple. And the Acolyte, to your point, one of the things I loved the most too was just seeing the Jedi in this kind of, if we don't tell anybody about this, we're probably going to be okay kind of thing, and that's not simple, a binary way of looking at things. And do you think people may have had an issue with that? And maybe that's why.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps. And I think that's that's also sort of a slower burn too, Pete, over the course of, 2 or 3 different sort of things. I think Rogue One actually did a pretty good job of illustrating part of that, which is hey, listen, man, gotta get a job, player. You know what I'm saying? Or my man came and scooped me up. There was nothing I could do, And so this series offered an interesting sort of Z-axis into that in a way that I thought really upset the apple cart, that provided a lot of insight into a lot of other characters. We talked about this, like when Luke asks Rey, like, what are you actually here for? Yeah. Like, do you know what you're actually doing? You know what I mean? And it's like, because it might not actually be what you think that it is. And that all kind of makes a little bit more sense when you think, if literally hundreds of years before, even the very people who executed the grandness of the order didn't even know necessarily what their own moral code was. And that alone was interesting enough. Right. You could have made a whole show about just that. And that part alone was fantastic to me. So what I'm getting at is that I don't want people to think that I'm upset about this because like something went wrong with the show. No, I just think that there were many well-executed tenets of this particular program that, if abandoned or, again, taken to an animated situation or perhaps a movie, I don't know what they become, but I do know that this particular phase of it made sense to me, and it never didn't. And that was kind of the biggest stinger of all this.
Yeah.
I think, and I agree with you, and I have a couple of quick points, and then we're going to get you out of here because we appreciate your time. But, same thing, watching the show when they have that first scene. And I had said to somebody, I didn't make a ton of predictions before this. One of my predictions was Yoda's not going to be in it. They're going to write him out with like one word of dialogue. Of course, we get the little tease at the end.
Yeah.
But when they did that scene and they're like, we need to take this to the council. And they're like, no, let's wait. Let's not get them involved. I felt like I had my Leo moment. I was like, there it is. That's how they're not only for Yoda, but for the shadiness of the Jedi. Like you said, this was pointing and planting seeds. And Leslie, like you said, Pete, and we've talked about this with Ryan Johnson. We've talked about this with Dave Filoni. Like, some of these Star Wars nerds who have gotten to make Star Wars things have put these layers in it that the wider range, my dad, who I love, who introduced me to Star Wars, who introduced me to sci-fi, who's a huge Star Trek guy. He's 70 years old. He wasn't prepared for the deeper levels of all the things that were in this. Right. He watched it and he was like, I like that Saul guy. I'm kind of sad he was a bad guy. I'm like, how did you not see that coming? And when I asked him how he felt about it not being renewed, he went, okay, what's the next thing that's coming out? Like, he's ready to move on. But I'm sitting there going, this is what we see in Phantom Menace. This is what we see when Luke tells Rey it's all hubris and everything else. So again, the layers of it and the amount of pieces. And the other thing that I want to bring up that you just said is all these different threads, all these different tenets, all these different parts of this show that didn't fully add up. And I'm going to throw a sports metaphor in there because I also love sports. I'm a sports guy from way back.
Okay.
This show for me was the 1995 Orlando Magic, who I was fully in the tank for, with Shaq and Penny and Hoji and Nick Anderson and Dennis Scott. And they went to play the Rockets in the finals and got swept out. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. That's not what this was supposed to be. All the pieces were there, all the parts were there, and it didn't work. And it didn't land. I'm not saying it didn't work. It didn't land.
I really like that ananalogy a lot. Shouts to Brian Hill, the coach of that team, by the way.
Exactly.
Who don't know. But I'm gonna say one last thing, Pete, before we close out, which is the other thing. You talk about Leo DiCaprio moments. So, and again, I'm talking a little out of turn here, but I remember when this show first started, I think it was episode 2, and I was like, oh, there's going to be a love scene in this show. Like, I guarantee you that somebody here will be involved in a romantic situation. And that was my first tip off that this was more YA than anything.
Yeah.
Because you could see this level of emotion, like just in the characters. People were looking good. Hairstyles were fly. Nothing wrong with this. And it was such a departure from the, oh, here's 800 dudes, once again, in a prison, or a bunch of creatures and animals that we don't really recognize out in the desert in Tatooine in some barren land. It was like, nah, this is a normal place with people who get it on and talk about their weekend plans on Monday mornings. Like, that kind of thing was really interesting. And so by the time that finally sort of happened at the end, I was like, I told you there is more happening than met the eye. And this makes complete sense. And that kind of put a bow on something that I think made sense in the context of all of the other sort of mystical storylines that were happening. You could tell from the behavior, the thespianism, and the commitment of the actors themselves. You know, this was chemistry that to me was palpable in a way that made this a better program. And I enjoyed every second of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too, to watch, you know, the fans that are so hell bent on bringing it back that they're putting together petitions and things like that. I love that kind of passion. That's awesome. That's what Star Wars needs to survive. And it does happen in different pockets. And now that Star Wars is so diverse in its story styles and its story timelines and where they are, there's something literally for everybody. Do you think, what kind of impact does this have? I know we know nothing about Skeleton Crew, and I know we're not going to make predictions, but Skeleton Crew is going to be another completely different genre.
It's another unknown quantity.
How's it going to
look? I don't know, man. At this point, you know, it's one of those things where, can you latch on to the people that you think you need to latch on to? I don't know. Does it become sort of a cult classic? I think of, like, this is going to sound so ridiculous, and I'm outing myself here a little bit, but like, this one season of The Acolyte reminds me immensely of the one season of a show called My So-Called Life that was on ABC that was like about teen kids in high school, and it was the most intense show at the time when I was watching it. And Claire Danes, Jared Leto, like people that were on that show and went on to other things. And I was like, how did this only last one season and affect my life so much? I feel like Acolyte is closer to that. I don't know what that means for everything else, and I don't want to speculate, but I just hope that, you know, what we've learned from all of this is that there are people that like a lot of things. And whether or not something is critically acclaimed might not necessarily correlate to its necessity to canon or the universe. And that goes all the way down to things like, again, you know, the Legos of the world, the visions of the world. Like, I don't even know how many views these things get, but I know that they matter to me, even if they're not the most popular things on the block. And so, you know, Acolyte might not have gotten the credit that a lot of people wanted it to get, but it is pretty number one in my heart. On a lot
I think that's such an important thing. Is it spoke to you? You're right. Visions for me, I liked season 2 a little bit better because I'm not an anime guy, but the people who love Visions, man, they will go to the mat for it, and they should, and that's fantastic. So I think that what it comes down to is remembering, I think, that, you know, Disney is the mothership. ESPN Connecticut's the mothership, but
technically Bristol is the mothership.
Yeah. That's right. Bristol's the mothership.
But you know, Disney they have to make money if we want to get more of this stuff. And so the decisions hurt. You know, if we've all, I mean, look, I cannot tell you how disappointed I was that the Dark Crystal series did not get renewed on Netflix. I was a huge fan of that, but I understand the business of it, and that's unfortunate. But I don't know where I'm going with that other than to say it's we just have to like just be happy that we live in a time where we're getting more Star Wars, where we have the Acolyte, where we have the Skeleton Crew coming in just a couple months, where we're playing Star Wars Outlaws right now, where we're in a great time, and hopefully, and I firmly believe that the characters, that story may not live on in live action, but it's going to be in comic books, it's going to be in novels. And I would push for it to at least give us an animated version. Let's see what happens when we take live action and put them into animation.
They bled a kyber crystal, for God's sakes. That was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. How can you just leave that in the ether? Anyway, don't get me started. Great. I just want to say that. I love this show. End of story. I'm Clinton Yates.
The end. Yeah. Well, Clinton, thank you so much for joining us, man. You are, you're always welcome, and love checking out Never Tell Me the Odds. What do you have coming up on Never Tell Me the Odds? Anything?
We got a couple different things coming up for the fall. We did our TV episode, The Ocho.
Oh, that was so awesome.
So good.
It's hard to describe. Switching gears here a little bit, boys, because you guys have been so supportive of everybody on the show, having Kelsey and everybody on. And, we got to do that. And it was one of those things where they said, all right, you guys got to make a 22-minute or whatever episode, like go for it. And we were like, done. We all knew where we were getting into the cockpit, completed the mission.
Yeah.
It was
nice.
So we all had a great time, and I think it turned out really well. Once again, shouts to Kelsey and Aaron for really making all this stuff happen. It was just a blast to be able to be a part of it.
That's awesome.
Kelsey's great. She was on with us a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to be honest, she's kind of taking a beating right now in our little fantasy Star Wars sports ball thing. But
please, she ate your lunch, all right, as she does per usual. Do not make me defend Kelsey when she's not here. This is how people get hurt.
No, this is the thing.
Rip people's arms off. All right,
this is the thing. I got the first couple of weeks. Pete kind of got there. But I've made bad choices for farther down the line.
Yeah.
Your matchups. She's gonna let me have it. She played the long game. I played up front.
I just want you to know you're not gonna catch me slipping.
No.
All right? I will be defending the squadron at all times.
100%. And I'm saying I get to be excited right now, but I know in the long run, Kelsey wins, and I recognize.
Very well. Very well.
Due respect.
Well, awesome. Well, Clinton, thank you so much for joining us, and we will speak to you again soon. And make sure you're listening to Never Tell Me the Odds on wherever you find podcasts. You don't want to miss it.
This is the way, kiddos.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Around the Galaxy. A huge thank you to Clinton Yates for joining us and sharing his insights on the Acolyte. And thank you for spending some time with us. We always recognize that you have a choice in Star Wars podcasts, and you chose us, and it means the world to us. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and leave us a review. Your feedback really does help us to continue to bring you the best in Star Wars content. Be sure to catch our live show every Thursday night at 9 p.m. East on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@SSW Network. We cover all the latest in Star Wars news. We dive into some interesting topics, and we feature more great guests, just like Clinton Yates. Plus, we watch the chat so we get to hear from you, and we want to stay connected with you, so join us on social media for the latest updates and behind-the-scenes content. Check out our website at theSSWNetwork.com, or follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at the SSW Network, or follow this show specifically at ATGcast. And remember, if you want to get closer to the action, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the SSW For as little as $3 a month, patrons get early access to episodes, exclusive insights to special events, and chances to be part of our live virtual audience when we record with celebrities. Do you have thoughts or questions about today's show? We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a voicemail at 504-321-1501, 504-321-1501. We love hearing from you. Well, thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, may the Force be with you. This show has been copyright 2024 Pete in the Seat Studios. Our music is brought to us by the band Apollo's Ghost.